One of the things that, a lot of the tools that say, hey, here's your top 10, right? And you get a report of the top 10 vulnerabilities. Well, that can give you a false sense of security if you take care of those top 10, because if there's actually a top 30 happening every month and you're only attacking the top 10, obviously your vulnerability profile is growing and you're not taking care of it.
SC Media is proud to present this month's CISO Stories program. Each month, the CISO Stories program explores a cybersecurity topic selected by Cyber Risk Alliance's CISO community and provides content that examines that topic from a variety of perspectives. Hosted by Todd Fitzgerald, best-selling author of CISO Compass, the CISO Stories weekly podcast features content powered by the 1,100-plus members of the Cyber Risk Alliance's CISO community. Listen to previous CISO Stories podcast episodes at CISOstoriespodcast.com. Cybersecurity Collaborative is a unique membership community enabling cybersecurity leaders to work together in a trusted environment. To learn more, visit CISOstoriespodcast.com/CSC. I'm your host, Todd Fitzgerald, and this week we welcome John Kellerhals, vCISO at Ascend Technologies. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Todd. Pleasure to be here today.
So John, I always like to ask our guests what interested them in the cybersecurity field. What piqued your interest? Because you've done a lot of interesting things.
So what piqued my interest is, a little bit of a career history here. I was in the nuclear power industry up until the year 2000 or so, and then I got into IT generically from a support perspective and doing different things. But security just grabbed a hold of me at one point and said, hey, the bad guys are making progress here, and I'd like to put my talents and energy and efforts towards beating the bad guys.
Well, and I don't know. We've done quite a number of podcasts now, and approaching a couple hundred, and I don't know that I've had a guest on that has had a degree in nuclear engineering before. So I don't know if you need to be a nuclear engineer to be a CISO.
No, but you certainly had the background to develop the skills that you needed to from an engineering perspective to do the other pieces, right? And I certainly have the math skills to do the activities associated with any calculations that are involved with cyber.
Well, good, and I appreciate the work. I know you also serve as the president of the local FBI InfraGard in Chicago, and I know that's a great partnership organization with our federal government.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm very interested in supporting that organization, and if anybody ever has any questions about it, feel free to reach out to me. And we're trying to grow our membership ranks in the Chicago area, so please, by all means, go to chicagoinfogard.org and take a look at that and fill out an application.
Absolutely. Well, today we're going to be talking about vulnerability management, which is such an important facet of any security program. So, given that we have this small set of vulnerabilities that tends to tends to get exploited, by the attacker community. What does your program look like? What's your approach to vulnerability management?
So thanks for the segue into that. The vulnerability management approach that we use and that I like to use is to kind of find out where every individual client is at, whether it's an individual company or a grouping of companies, is finding out where they're at and then meeting the client where they're at to do stuff. Because vulnerability management can a lot of times feel like a whack-a-mole game, where you take care of some stuff there, you find some stuff that needs attention, and you put the right resources on prioritizing the attentions, right? A lot of the activities associated with vulnerability management is making sure that you have all your assets covered, right? And that's what every organization struggles with, is making sure that they've got everything in the program so that you can find out what it is and then take care of it. So from the standpoint of, doing that, finding the scans, finding out what patching is working, what patching is not working, and then targeting the things that are most critical to the organization for closing those gaps, if you will.
I mean, the asset management has always been we always talk about it being a difficult thing because there's always assets that we don't seem to have the visibility to. Do you have any, suggestions as to how we get better at that asset management so that we know, what it is that we're actually trying to protect?
So I've done a variety of different things to try and get that asset fidelity up to 100%. And there's always somebody or someone that has something or some exception for that. But typical scanning tools that are commercially available in use will find out an awful lot of the information. Use some network access control tools in the right environments to make sure that only the devices that you want are in there and in place. And if it's not an identified asset, it won't be allowed to connect into your environment. But a lot of the scanning tools, and again, it depends on how large the organization is. If you're an organization of 10 or 50, you can have reasonable assurance of what you have. But if you're over 1,000 or 5,000, there's always the possibility that something is not in the program and that you continuously update that. So it's important to run scans. It's important to have the ability to deploy agents in a lot of cases for vulnerability management. Because when you run a scan, right, so let's say you do a scan a month or a scan a week or whatever it is, if those devices aren't plugged in at that particular time, they don't get scanned. But if you have an agent on the device, every time it connects, it gives you a report every couple hours or so, so you can have some higher confidence level in terms of knowing that you have the environment that you're trying to protect. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So how do we prioritize our vulnerabilities? A lot of these tools spit out all these different vulnerabilities. How do we know where we should be starting?
So, another great question. The ability to have the tool set up properly and scan at the right time is what's critical, especially if you don't have agents. I was at one organization where we had roughly 20,000 vulnerabilities for the organization and roughly 3,000 people in the organization. And I looked at the scanning schedules that were set up, and most of the scan schedules were set up to happen on a Saturday, on a weekend, right? And so most of the workstations and laptops were either powered off or taken home. So we didn't have a great inventory of the vulnerabilities. And so I spent quite a bit of time tweaking and tuning the scanning schedule so that, number one, you don't crush your network, right? I mean, that's something that can absolutely happen if you scan everything simultaneously. You can bring the network down. Don't recommend that. So go slow and cautiously when you're doing that type of an environmental scan. But after I got that tuned and tweaked, we went from 20,000 vulnerabilities to over 100,000 vulnerabilities. And, the first time I presented that to the CIO said, "John, what did you do?" I'm like, these always existed. I didn't create these vulnerabilities. You now have visibility of the one that you didn't have, right? So once you get that massive list, right, what do people do? And you need somebody that, like you said, can prioritize the most important ones. And what I like to do from a priority perspective is to look at the code that is actually being exploited in the wild right now, right, as the highest priority. Then I look at the ability to do that exploit. Can it be done remotely, or does somebody have to be in physical contact with a device or endpoint or something like that? So if it can be done, if the exploit can be done remotely and there's active code out there that's allowing the bad actors to exploit it, and you have the severity levels that are important or activities that are out there that can be done, those get my attention first, right?
How do you determine if something's being exploited in the wild?
So, being an InfraGard and a number of other organizations, I pay attention to, notifications from people. Hey, saw this, and this is happening, right? So being plugged in and tuned into a lot of different feed sources kind of gives you the insight in advance of what may be publicly announced on the news. or that type of thing. In some cases, the FBI does give us non-public information. It's not classified information by any means, but we do get some insight into some stuff that hits the news channels maybe a few hours in advance of everybody else. But staying in touch with that, and the tools themselves sometimes have feeds that tell you, hey, this is a remote code exploitation capability type thing, so pay attention to this, and there are kits available and that type of stuff. So, paying attention to that makes a huge difference, right? And it takes somebody that's focused on that activity. Not every business executive can spend the time staying up to speed on that.
I know there's some tools out there that not that we're advocating any specific tools here, but that take the vulnerability data and then create some sort of prioritization matrix for that, based on your assets, what you have on your assets. Have you found those to be useful or not?
Well, so what I like to do is I like to export the results into a CSV file and do filtering and sorting. And I say that because just because it's maybe a 2 or a 3 doesn't mean the bad guys aren't going after it from a severity level, right? 4s and 5s, everybody knows and understands you have to attack those pretty quickly. But the bad guys may go after you low and slow, and may go after a severity level 2 type vulnerability, and you have to pay attention to those as well. So there's no silver bullet, there's no magic answer to it, but you do need to be responsive if you see something take place, right? And sometimes the bad guys do attacks on some of the tool sets, right? And so some of the tool sets that you use to make sure you're okay, when they go away and you become blind, then it gets very interesting in terms of what you have to do and what you have to monitor or check for.
I've implemented vulnerability management scanning tools and different platforms, different companies, and at some point they almost seem to be some of them commodities. Are there certain features that you find are like, hey, this is again, not any particular product, but either features that are in these products or features that you'd like to see that don't exist that we should be having in these tools?
So let me address it from the standpoint of features that I'd like to see in the tools, and it comes down to reporting to help people prioritize stuff. One of the things that a lot of the tools that say, hey, here's your top 10, right? And you get a report of the top 10 vulnerabilities. Well, that can give you a false sense of security if you take care of those top 10, because if there's actually a top 30 happening every month and you're only attacking the top 10, obviously your vulnerability profile is growing and you're not taking care of it. I'd like to see some of the built-in filters that will say, hey, for the stuff that's remotely exploitable and the stuff that's actively in the wild and of this priority, give me that list, right? And it might be a large list, right? But in some cases, you have, to use the resource you have available to patch those things judiciously, because there's more activities than can be done by most organizations, even healthy organizations, to take care of it. The thing that I do like is that the tools do say, hey, here's the vulnerabilities, and CISA is alarming on these particular tools. But then there's the other piece that it tells you, hey, those are patchable. And then you have some that says these are not patchable. For example, what I like to use as the example of not patchable is, let's say you have Windows 2003 server in your environment and you're still using FTP to communicate information for running the business, right? You can't fix that, right? That has to go into, a business plan to, retire that existing environment and to get to a secure protocol for transmitting information. And that typically is going to be budgetarily required, and it's going to take you 6 to 9 months typically to get that approved and in place to get it fixed. So the tools are telling you, hey, this is patchable, you should go after this. These other things you need to, put into some other mechanism. And I'm not a believer of taking vulnerabilities and putting it into the risk register. But I do believe in the case of the non-patchable stuff where you have to do technical debt retirement, if you will, that that actually belongs on the risk register to say, hey, this is something that can't be patched, can't be fixed. There's probably no mitigation controls available to you to solve that particular problem or vulnerability, and the business just needs to move as quickly as they can to retire some of the stuff that is no longer supported. Make sense?
Yeah. Are there certain metrics that you find are valuable in tracking vulnerability management?
So it's funny. Everybody asks the question, what are the key metrics for doing this, and how do you know you're being successful? And I've been in organizations where, take the example of the 100,000, right? Leadership at that point said 100,000 is way too high. Do everything you can to get that number down as quickly as you can. And I said, do you want me to factor in, the highest threat to the organization, or do you want me to just get the numbers down fast? And of course, the answer is always both, right?
Yeah.
And I understand that that's what they want to do. So it's a balancing act again in terms of, getting the numbers down. What I find to be important is that the number of vulnerabilities are declining month over month over month. And one of the things that you can do to make sure you're not chasing your tail is figuring out the scan schedules or the, review schedules, if you will. Sometimes you can scan all the time. Sometimes you do once a week. But what you don't want to do is scan the vulnerability when it's first come out and, in advance of Patch Tuesday. Now you have this high number of vulnerabilities that are out there. And after Patch Tuesday, it's fixed it. It's fixed this amount here. So you want to make sure that you're scanning after you've done the patching, so you're working with a real number versus an artificial number of vulnerabilities, right? And so I like to do before and afters, because the before and after the Patch Tuesday implementation tells me, are we making progress on the vulnerabilities, right? Then there's always some lagging type things where some device didn't connect in and it hasn't done something that is beneficial to get patched. But one of the biggest things that organizations can do to reduce their vulnerabilities is have a reboot schedule for workstations, on some regular periodic basis, right? Because when you do the vulnerability scans, the tool is always going to tell you, hey, this vulnerability exists, but it will go away once the machine is rebooted, right? And you say, oh, how many reboots, are needed for the environment? In some cases, you have, 5 machines that need to be rebooted. In other cases, you need 100 machines to be rebooted. And you look at the last time it was rebooted, and it was a couple months ago. So all that patching you've done has not taken effect yet. So a lot of places are now saying, hey, we want you to reboot. In some cases, at the most conservative organizations, daily. And at other places, it's, hey, you should reboot your machine at least once a week. And that will get the updates pushed.
I think that's great advice. I worked at one organization. One of the things that when we did our management reporting that we had to tackle was that you mitigate these vulnerabilities this month, and then next month there's more vulnerabilities. So it looks like you didn't do anything, that your vulnerabilities increased. So you have to be tracking the reduction, and then also how many of these vulnerabilities are new vulnerabilities the next month that you're also trying to fight against.
Yeah. So, in the tool that I'm currently using, which is Qualys, and I've used Rapid7 before. They're both good tools. It gives you on a widget page you can build that tells you, hey, this is the number that came up this month, and these are the ones that have been remediated this month. So you can track that and trend that. And we do exactly that type of trending for our clients. It says this is the progress we're making, and we have a negative downward trend for all of those scores. Those are the things that are important, right? Because you're always going to get 0 days that flash in there that will skew some numbers and do different things. But making sure that you're making progress for the appropriate stuff. And there's always outliers. There's always some machine that didn't get an update because maybe the configuration was set wrong, and you've got security updates that haven't been happening for the last 6 months, right? So you've got to pay attention to those things, even if they're not flagged in the top 4s and 5s, right? You've got to pay attention to the whole environment. And in some cases it's important, and in other cases, it's so protected by other stuff around it that it's not as significant. It all depends on the environment, and every environment is different. You know that, right?
And So when we're trying to reduce the number of vulnerabilities in our organization, the CISO has one role, but they're not the people that are actually patching these systems.
Correct.
And so, how have you found the best way to engage the other stakeholders in the organization to make sure that these vulnerabilities get fixed in a timely manner?
So that's a great question. And I've been in organizations that do a fairly good job of that. And I've been in organizations where, the security team just says, hey, here's 100,000 vulnerabilities, go fix them, right? And then the infrastructure team looks at it and says, I don't know where to start. Right. And so that's where you need a partnership to say, hey, here's the stuff we're going to go after. Here's the things that we see across our entire environment that maybe we can fix on an automated basis. And in some cases, you take manual actions to do some things if it's not working. Right. And so there's always that dichotomy or split between, a team that does patches and the other team that does updates for like Office updates. Right. In some cases, an automated tool will push out something and says, hey, I'm ready to do this. You give the users an opportunity to, defer it a couple of times for a couple hours, because the last thing you want to do is have, your sales team in front of the client and all of a sudden an update forces their machine to shut down. So you have to be sensitive to make sure that that doesn't happen at inopportune times, right? And patching type things typically work fairly well. But when you do the updates for Office or something like that, depending on the tool that you're using, sometimes a push from that tool may create an inopportune reboot on somebody's machine and doesn't give them the option to delay it or defer it. So, looking through that, and again, how many times Chrome gets updated, how many times Adobe gets updated, how many times those things happen. You want to make sure that you're paying attention to that. And it's funny in some regards. People can have a user downloaded application, and you pick the name of the application, right? Versus the enterprise controlled one. If the users have the enterprise controlled one, typically, that can be an automated update with very little pain or friction to the client and users, right? If they've downloaded it on their own, it doesn't fall within that. You can't do an update from an automated tool. And what you have to do then is go and locally manually uninstall the user downloaded one and then put the enterprise one in place. Mm-hmm. So there's always that mix, if you will. And again, if you follow the 80-20 rule, right? If you can get most of it done, the 80% done by automation, and then focus on the one-offs, you'll eventually get the technical depth for that organization retired. Mm-hmm.
Great advice. Well, this has been great, John. What final advice would you give to emerging CISOs, new CISOs, current CISOs, experienced CISOs as they're trying to enhance their vulnerability management programs?
So work with the business, understand what the business needs are, what the requirements are. You can learn the hard way, or you can talk to some people that have experienced it the hard way when your CEO's laptop rebooted in the middle of a presentation because you pushed something that you didn't realize pushed it at the wrong time. So work with the business, know when you can do those types of things, and establish pilot groups so that when you block certain things that are known vulnerabilities, you have a reasonable understanding of what the impact or friction is going to be on the end user clients, right? So, let's take SMB, right? You block that SMB1 because it's, a known vulnerability. And that's when you find out, if you haven't looked into it, that you have 20 printers that now don't function, right? And then now you've created an emergency. So the best advice I can give people is talk to the business, understand what they have, and then work in partnership with, your infrastructure team, your SOC, whatever it is, so that when you do these changes, they know that you made this change here, because invariably you won't get it right and you'll create some type of interruption. And if the SOC or the infrastructure team or your service desk knows about it, they can say, oh, this guy just pushed this patch. We know what it is. We have to revert something, as opposed to, taking a long time and swamping out the other part of the business. So that's the best
Absolutely. That change management is so important. Well, thanks, John. Thanks for taking the time today. I really appreciate your insights.
Anytime, Todd. Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you for tuning in for this week's episode of the CISO Stories podcast. Please subscribe to the CISO Stories podcast and you will receive a new story each Tuesday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. We'll see you next week for a new episode.